And welcome back to the show. While coronavirus cases are declining and vaccinations are increasing daily, many companies have been using this opportunity to find a strategy to safely restore their offices to operations, which resemble where they were before the pandemic. Now, nearly a third of companies have yet to develop any vaccine policy, according to a survey of 770 companies. So, what are the issues with respect to complying with COVID-19 regulations in the workplace? Joining us to share a little bit more about this, we've got Patrick Boyd, who is the founding partner at the Boyd Law Group. And Patrick, good to have you here.
My pleasure to be here.
And so let's get at this here. When we talk about getting ready to get back into the workplace, we do know that companies are gearing up and employees, some are coming with reluctance, but yet and still it is the obligation of employers to have COVID regulations. Give us a little bit of an update as to where we are.
Sure, Darren. So I think the first issue that's coming to light a lot is whether or not employers can mandate that their workers returning are vaccinated, right? And that's been an issue that's now been decided upon, or at least we've had guidance on that from the EEOC 2 times. That guidance generally standing for the proposition that yes, an employer can say, I want you to come back to work, and when you come back to work, I want you to be vaccinated to return. Now, just to be clear, the EEOC has issued some guidance along those lines. One, the employers are supposed to appreciate the fact that some workers are still not going to have access or ready access to the vaccination. So we shouldn't have any socioeconomic discrimination going on with respect to saying you can only come back to work when you're vaccinated if people can't get that vaccination, right? And then there's 2 other items. The first is kind of an easy one because there's good established law on this, but there are people who have religious beliefs that dictate that they're not supposed to take certain vaccinations. And those people with those objections are still entitled to make those objections to taking a new vaccination. There's already established case law on how the employer is supposed to address that. So it's probably nothing novel for the virus to consider, but that's one issue. And the second and more interesting with respect to COVID is for those people that have particular disabilities, right? Perhaps they didn't take the vaccine because they're very vulnerable, and so they're worried that even if they take the vaccine, they may be exposed when they get back to work, because a lot of us don't know, I don't think any of us know for sure, how long the protections of the vaccines are going to last, right? For those workers, the general guidance is that the employers are supposed to have a dialogue with them. Might it be that, that those workers can come back on shifts that are less populated? Might those workers be able to come back wearing masks? Might those workers be able to continue to work remotely until they get more security in the workplace? So big picture answer, employers are allowed to require employees to be vaccinated, but there is some subtlety as to how to make sure that vaccination requirement is implemented to be fair and to get people back, but back safely and comfortably in their workplace.
Let me go from the status of being an employee and share this perspective. If I'm an employee, I walk to my job says, okay, we don't have to wear a mask in this environment. But I'm a person that feels like I'm not so sure, Delta variant, and I'm worried about possibly exposing people at home who may not be vaccinated. And I want to wear my mask. Could I have received possibly a potential penalty if the rest of my employees, at my fellow coworkers at the job, don't wear a mask and I opt to wear a mask? Could there be a penalty for wearing a mask now?
So there certainly wouldn't be a meaningful legal basis for penalizing somebody for taking that extra security measure. It would be no different than somebody wearing a mask, quite frankly, before COVID, if they were just concerned about virus exposure or otherwise. The thing to keep in mind, I think, for those workers, though, is that the employer may, as very much as you're saying, they have 2 tracks, right? The employer can choose to continue to have a mask requirement and social distancing, or the employer can choose not to have that mask mandate and not to require social distancing. Just to be clear, though, even in the more free of workplaces, if you will, those work environments where masks are not required and social distancing is not required, the employer is going to need to tell people who are not vaccinated, that is, those people who have not been vaccinated, to keep a mask on and to social distance. To be practical, it is a bit of the honor system in terms of whether or not employers are going to scrutinize everybody's vaccination proof or not, but ultimately, the workplace is supposed to be fair in that manner, and employers have these 2 choices. As to your question, if somebody's still concerned and they're still worried about being exposed, they can wear a mask. Indeed, they should wear a mask if they feel most comfortable doing that, and just go about doing their job to the best of their ability.
Yeah, let me ask the question about Title VII for a minute. Give us a little bit about Title VII and also the ADA.
Sure. Well, so those are the federal statutes that would define those types of accommodations required for people who either A, have a disability, that's the Disability Act, right? Or B, for some other reason, perhaps based on their religion, they feel like they're not fairly being required to get those vaccines. And in both of those cases, those workers have the opportunity to engage and indeed the obligation along with the employer to engage in some dialogue as to whether or not the workplace can be accommodative to their concerns, that is accommodative to their religious concerns or accommodative as to their disability in a manner such that they can feel protected, but nevertheless the employer can get things back in terms of getting everybody back to work. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And when we talk about those with disabilities, obviously they have a certain set of accommodations that are going to be needed. Coming out of COVID-19, we know that a lot of people are still going to be worried about first those accommodations that were there pre-COVID and now post-COVID. And so, do we look at it as being pretty hard for businesses to be able to accommodate those with the ADA requirements?
I think it's going to be a challenge for certain, and I think there's going to be a fair amount of debate as to what accommodation is reasonable. The law just stands for the proposition that the accommodation should be a reasonable accommodation, and what is reasonable is going to depend upon the status of the workplace, the type of the job the person does. Right? Some jobs you have to be there at work to do it. Some jobs you don't. Right? And indeed the size of the employer. The bigger the employer, the more capacity they have to offer accommodations, right? If you're a two-person business, however, you may not have that flexibility, and the law requires, or the law understands that accommodative flexibility does not exist as much for smaller businesses, and so there's going to be a balancing with respect to those accommodations and what's offered, and probably some debate about it, and probably some litigation on it too.
Yeah. As a lawyer, talk to me about what are you anticipating as some of your legal concerns that we can see now as we are reopening, coming into the workplace. What do you see as some of the things you'll be dealing with on your plate?
Well, I think maybe one of the most interesting aspects is this new understanding we have about the idea on the one hand that many workers and even many studies show that remote work is effective and can even make workers more productive, right? But on the other hand, the challenge that employers have in managing that remote workforce and making sure that people are doing their jobs and perhaps most importantly, collaborating with the other people that do their jobs. It's one thing to know that John and Jane are working together well, and if they have an issue, one is down the hallway from another in an office or in a bullpen. It's a different situation to know that John and Jane are working together, but you have to count on them to Zoom with one another or interface with one another by calls. So one of the things that we're seeing as a significant request from employers is for guidance on remote work policies. How can I allow my workers on the one hand to work remotely, but on the other hand, how can I guarantee that they're being effective? How can I monitor their work? And what kind of standards and guideposts can I set for them to make sure if they're going to work from remotely and they're going to be accountable remotely, that I can feel comfortable that they're working remotely and being accountable. The interesting sort of macro observation from that point is that different employers are reacting to this differently. You may have seen Salesforce, which is a tremendously sized company. They've established a protocol where they're really trying to do everything they can to allow for a work from any place protocol for their workers. And they think that's good for morale, and they think that's good for productivity, and they're going in that direction. On the other hand, or on the other side of the polls, if you will, Goldman Sachs came out and said that they think remote work is an absolute aberration to the way people have worked, and that they expect people back to work as soon as possible. So obviously different industries, different leadership, and different corporate cultures, but I do think there's going to be a lot of challenges with respect to employers and how they enforce or not remote work policies and how much they embrace that or not.
Yeah, and you talk about that, whether or not I have the option of working from home or coming in. Goldman Sachs is a great example. We know that Goldman Sachs does require its employees to actually come back. Now, talking to some that are familiar with Goldman Sachs, others that are familiar with other companies that are requiring people to come in, there's still this set of hesitancy. Is there any option for those employees who say, listen, I don't feel comfortable. My job is telling me to come in. Do I have any legal recourse in saying, well, can we get a little stay here?
Absent an allowance from the employer, or absent a disability or religious basis, not so much. If the employer says come back to work, you're going to have to come back to work. I do think that the norms are going to change over time, and we may have an evolving culture altogether, but I don't quite know how that's going to play out. An interesting side observation, demographically, I think the report is now that 1.8 million women do not intend to go back to work. They were home for COVID. They had the opportunity to work with their kids, or maybe the obligation, or maybe both, to work with their kids in schooling, and have decided or opted that they're not going to go back. So that's that very much maybe a significant loss for us in terms of a talented labor pool. It may also be something that tips the scales and makes some employers say, boy, I really want this woman to continue to work for me. I'm going to have to change my norms to allow her to continue to work, but to embrace that remote work protocol. So interesting insights on that point.
Yeah. Well, I'll say this, a lot is going to be on the plate, and a guy like yourself, doesn't like you'll be going out of business anytime soon. There'll be a lot to discuss and a lot to take to the courtroom. Patrick Boyd, thanks for being with us here.
Can I'd like to mention that unemployment entitlement option also, just because it's an interesting protocol, if you don't mind.
Real quick, because I got 30 seconds.
Oh, geez. Okay. So just to be clear, unemployment benefits for those people collecting the enhanced benefit will expire in September. As a result, we do expect to see more people returning to work, and a lot more hearty debate as they get back to work in the fall. Interesting developments to see.
All right, we'll bring you back, Patrick. Patrick Boyd from the Boyd Law Group. Thank you so much.
My pleasure as always.
All right, now, if you want to find out more information about Patrick and anything that we just discussed, please go to the website, theboydlawgroup.com, theboydlawgroup.com. All right, we're taking a quick break here on Open. We ask that you stay with us. We'll come right back right after this.